So today we have Dr. Jane Remington-Gurney, who's here to share a little bit about her experiences with caregiver and partner coaching. Hi, Jane.
Hi, how are you, Tana?
I'm doing great today. It's a little sunnier than usual in Seattle.
Well, I think we've got your historic rain because it's pouring outside.
Oh, man.
It will be for another 7 days.
Good for the farmlands.
Very good.
Yeah. So why don't you go ahead and start us out, Dr. Remington-Gurney, and just kind of talk a little bit about who you are and where your interests are.
Okay, well, I'm at the moment in Australia, in Brisbane, but originally I did my training in the UK, and then I worked for a while in Canada and did a little bit of work in the Solomon Islands as well before staying here in Brisbane. I'm a speech pathologist by profession, but I have worked mainly with people with complex communication needs. This has often meant for me that I've had to learn a lot of aided and unaided communication systems, but never really losing sight of speech and ways to promote spoken language. In the last few years, especially with COVID, I've changed the way I work into developing some online courses for communication partners. And these have proved very successful both here and overseas. So I'm hoping to be able to share a little bit of that information with you too.
Excellent. I hope so as well. Is there anything else you'd like to share about your background before we get started with some questions?
Well, in my background, I also have an interest and a passion for dog training and also dance, and they may seem odd things to be interested in, but they do have a common thread, and the common thread is movement. And that thread of movement extends into the work that I do in augmentative and alternative communication. So we can perhaps touch on that as we go in this interview. So you have some questions for me.
I do. And it's also awesome that you mentioned dance and dog training. Although my dog training skills are rather limited, I am trained in ballet, and I was a ballet dancer for about 16 years.
Yes.
Yeah. And love dogs. They are my favorite animal. My kids were actually just asking me about that the other day. My favorite animal, and such an overlap between caring and teaching dogs and some of the principles that we apply in our everyday therapy. So I just thought I'd share.
Oh, that's beautiful, because it's so much in common. And we've got you must have a good eye for observing behaviors and tiny movements and reading what they could mean communicatively. So
absolutely, absolutely. You spot on. I couldn't have said it better. And making sure that you reinforce them appropriately as well.
Yes.
Right? In a way that's meaningful to the person producing them or the little furry person.
Do you find too that people say with you working with your clients that you see things that I just don't see?
Yes.
You hear things that I just don't hear. And sometimes that makes me really question, well, is it me? But then the person makes progress, and it's such a relief to know that you saw those early signs, you heard those, you felt those early signs. So I think one of the things we have to teach communication partners in training is observation skills and listening skills. So
absolutely, yeah. And sometimes having to assign interpretation to those just so that you can get some headway, right, into teaching and helping that communicator blossom. Yeah, I'm excited to learn more about your perspective. So I'm going to jump in with a question and just kind of set the stage here. And I'm wondering, what is your philosophy on caregiver coaching for AAC success?
Well, there's a lot of words in that question that have to be unpacked. So first, if we have to recognize that communication is a basic human need. And it's through conversation that we develop relationships and gather information that we need in our lives. So my philosophy on communication is that it's a dynamic system. And I'm borrowing that term there from dynamic systems theory. So I would encourage everyone who's listening to just go and have a look at that, especially language acquisition and dynamic system theory in bilingualism. Because the AAC language that we are referring to is multimodal. It includes speech, but it's aided and unaided, not unaided or aided. And we have to ultimately try and share the unaided and aided communication for conversational purposes. And you'll often find that one system alone can't meet that need as well as the two systems together. So what I teach is that there is no one best method. And this is where I think coaching is so important. So my philosophy on coaching is that as a coach, you must know your topic. So this means for some people, some speech pathologists, that you do have to step back for a little bit and get to know your material before you even attempt to try and teach it to others. So in AAC, that you have to know aided and unaided systems, and you have to be able to see movement as communication. Just because a person doesn't point to a communication device or sign in a particular way, it doesn't mean that their body isn't doing other signals that need to be harnessed and brought into a communication dictionary. In Lyle Lloyd's words, and Lyle was a great guru in our profession, he uses the words knowledge, skill, and experience. So most importantly, I think a coach must be able to translate their knowledge, skill, and experience into plain English and see things through the eyes of the person that they're coaching. So this last point, I think, is where we as professionals fail. If you listen to some of the YouTube footage from caregivers and communication partners, a lot of the time they struggle with what they're being taught. And I think that struggling with what they're being taught can sometimes be broken down into how they're being taught, the language that's being used in teaching. We're not there to impress with the language that we know, the terms that we know, the acronyms. We're there to find out what they know and build on that. In my training, I tried to address that because people just didn't seem to be taking away as much from those formal AAC workshops as I would have liked, or that they reported from other workshops that they were bringing back. So what I do is provide a plain English slide share with heaps of video and graphic illustrations, even cartoons, because you want to make language visual and you want them to remember what they've heard. And I think a good way to do that is to use lots of visuals. By course 5, what I've aimed for is that they are so used to now being able to go to a reference document and start to see written information and be able to look at hyperlinks and footnotes that explain the information that might not be immediately clear to them, that by course 5, they are starting now to read highlights from journal articles and examine their own observations to be able to self-regulate themselves. Because we've got to remember that when we teach people, we need to notice their body. And often when they're learning, if things are starting to get a little bit tricky, they'll do things like raise their shoulders and stop breathing, or get distracted, or need a coffee, or need to move around. Okay, so we need to look at self-regulation and active listening and looking. So I suppose that's a long-winded answer, but my philosophy on coaching is really no different to what any coach might tell you, a true coach. Know your topic, know your trainee, and translate what you know to meet their needs, not yours. I hope that helps.
No, it does. And yeah, and I'm hearing just you're meeting these students, whether they be, I imagine, professionals, some of them, or caregivers, care providers that are not family members. You're meeting them where they are and trying to adjust the content so that you can feel quite confident that they're walking away understanding not only what you're saying, but how to apply it to their unique situation.
Yeah, and in course 1, we look at the generations of the generational differences, if you like, in caregivers, because even in my lifetime, when I started working with people who needed AAC, they were all in institutions. In the UK, some of them had been dropped off when the circus came to town. Some of them were hearing impaired. Some of them were girls who got pregnant when they were 15 and they'd never got out of the institution. So they had huge language needs, and they were being supported by some people in their 60s, their 40s, their 30s, you know, and each time that generation comes in contact with them, they have a different set of belief systems.
Right.
So sometimes we might be amazed at the perceptions that the people have that we're trying to train as communication partners, and they need to be addressed. People who need AAC are not necessarily intellectually disabled. They don't have the language to express what they know. So we have to be very careful about the presumptions we make because they don't have speech.
Right. And it sounds like even very careful about what presumptions others might have that we might take for granted as the same as our own, but might be quite different depending on their stage in life and their own experiences and attitudes about these different topics.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Very cool to consider. Very interesting. That's actually something I've never thought of before, that generational gap and how that impacts perhaps the way that a carer perceives an individual who needs AAC. I think a lot in our current day about the cultural considerations and diversity considerations, but age is not often one that we talk a lot about.
And I think we need to talk about it. We need to listen, because often the older generation has been in that group of people who see people with difference shut away. And they're often told these people are intellectually disabled, you know, they couldn't do this, they can't do that, etc. And therefore they talk to them as though they can't. They might raise their voice. They might have different communication strategies to the 20-year-old teacher who hasn't got that experience, who is on the road for inclusion and non-segregation. So take time.
Yeah, super interesting to consider. Again, just totally having an impact on their interaction style, right? Which we know is a huge part of whether an individual will be successful with an AAC strategy or not. So absolutely, thank you for sharing that. I'm wondering, what are your top 3 tips for AAC professionals who are coaching caregivers?
Okay, well, first of all, I would say coach people for success in what they need, not what you want. So ultimately, you want the person to be able to perhaps sequence symbols, sequence words to make a sentence. That might not be what the communication trainee or the partner wants. They might want something very basic, like to be able to say, I want to go to the toilet. Whatever yours, I don't quite sure in the US what your sign for toilet is, but I often go to a natural gesture, because sometimes the generation of person that we're working with has now got to learn that this is toilet.
Right.
Okay. So again, it's got to be something that meets the need for what they need, and then they'll keep coming to therapy. Right. You've got to motivate them. They've got to be seen in themselves that they're making success. Okay. Secondly, I would say tell them and reinforce what they do right, not what they do wrong. Their job is hard enough without us telling them about another point of failure. We have to remember that a lot of the people we're working with may be in a stage of grief, anger, whatever, for a longer period of time than others. So keep checking on where they are and reinforcing the little things that you see them do right. Most importantly, put it in the reports. Because so often, I don't know about you, Tana, but I read reports on some of the people that I work with, and it's just from beginning to end, the person can't, won't, needs to, should be able to, is deficit in, all right? It's depressing, and it's not very easy for let's say a parent or a caregiver to read that sort of information, let alone be told, would you give it to other people? Right? Very often what they do, the person with AAC, what they do is seen as a reflection on the caregiver. So we have to remember those sorts of things to build a good, solid relationship. And finally, I'd say that AAC is a huge field, and augment only means to supplement. And in this case, supplement for speech. So all of us need to really keep our eye on the technology ball, because the use of vocalization, speech, movement around the face is going to play such an important role in technology of the future that we mustn't give up on getting movement from this area as well as the limbs that the OT and the physio might be working on. Working on movement and speech skills with the use of accelerators, and that might include things like music, a metronome, touch. Okay, those are things that I refer to as accelerators. Those are things that move on. We're used to the term catalysts, but these are things that help to progress the person in their intervention program.
I'm going to stop you there and just ask a follow-up question a little bit on this, piece that you're just mentioning about movement and voice and the horizon of technology. Tell me a little bit more about what you envision happening in using these subtle movements and sounds in furthering our AAC technology.
Well, I think already we're seeing with our kids that they can use Alexa and, you know, the smart devices. And some of the people I'm working with can actually use that using their voice, right? They can use their voice to turn on and turn off environmental controls. They can have a buzzer switch on their larynx if they want to use vocal control for switch activation for a communication device. And I think the world recognizes that speech is ultimate. That's what you really want to be aiming for. Only this week I've had a gentleman with a stroke, and he was discharged after 2 days, which is, you know, pretty phenomenal in my experience. But he was asked if he would like some picture cards to help him communicate, and of course he said no. He doesn't want picture cards. He wants his speech back, because with his speech, he was able to maintain his relationship with his family. He was able to maintain his job, his position in the pecking order, if you like.
Right.
He certainly doesn't want pictures, which is what one of his kids might use. So we need to take time. And even if a person has lost speech, we need to include speech work within the intervention program, because we don't know what's on the horizon. But I suspect there are enough people out there who are thinking, if I lost my speech, I don't want any pictures. I want to be able to use this, even if it's for assistive technology.
Yeah,
that's common sense.
Very true. Yeah. That's really exciting to think about some of that coming to be and being driven by the needs and desires of the community who benefits from this technology, as it should be.
Yes.
So I wondered if you could touch a little bit on what you believe the largest barriers that you see are for professionals in coaching success.
Okay. So I used to use the term catalysts and barriers. That was fine by me. And then I did my PhD research, and I was looking for a theory to ground the research in. And I came across dynamic systems theory. And in that work by Thielen and Smith, they use the terms accelerators and distractors. And to me, those terms seemed much more fluid, and they showed a better responsiveness to change, because lots of things can come in to slow down or speed up someone's progress, but they're not fixed. They're not always there, they change. So rather than barriers, I think I'd rather use it this time, distractors. So I think one of the biggest distractors is lack of training, not necessarily just in AAC, but in pre-dedicated AAC systems and tools. So this is the information that you give to people about communication, about conversation, about the different ways we communicate, and the skills and knowledge that we need in order to move on into dedicated AAC systems and tools. So this is why I designed my courses to lead into the courses, something like the courses that you're doing, Tana, so that people get the foundation skills to enable them to absorb more information about AAC specifics. Secondly, I would say lack of focus on total communication. When we go into AAC, sometimes we tend to go, I think, a little bit too quickly to a dedicated method. And we have to remember that there is no one best method. We need to be looking at a variety. You can't take a vodka in the swimming pool, but you can take a float board with some basic communication on it. And last of all, I would say a distractor is this incredibly slow trajectory in communication partner training and design that we continue to see. I've been in the business now for 40 years, and I would acknowledge that there is a lot of progress, but a lot of that progress has been bound up in disability policy and process. So it's bound up in deinstitutionalization, policies of inclusion. We've almost been forced along to address communication partner training, but still that trajectory is slow. I remember for 20 years ago, I had to get permission for parents and support workers to attend communication partner training and AAC courses, because that was thought to be something only in the realms of professionals. I still don't see parents delivering the AAC training, parents moving up into communication partner assistant level so that they can train people with less knowledge and skill. We've still got an awful long way to go, because there will never be enough speech pathologists to address this need for AAC.
Yeah. So
I'm big distractors.
Yeah, these are the big distractors. And so I'm also hearing you kind of touch on the multimodal piece as being a big one. And I know that a lot of the times what our caregivers here, at least here in the States, they hear a lot about the technology and not a lot about the methods and the interaction style. So even from a marketing perspective, AAC does start to then be presented to families as technology.
What I try to emphasize in the training that I do is its technique before technology. And that's to try and make that technology a little bit more successful, because you can't, there's a lot behind the technology. I mean, you've got to be able to turn it on in the first place. And a lot of people with AAC needs are still reliant on their communication partners to get to those little buttons to actually turn them on. They can't power them up. So there's still a dependency there. It's not a question of just putting the technology in front of the person and, you know, hey, whiz bang, we're there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have another question kind of related to distractors, if you will. Thinking about that same idea of distractors to coaching success, what would you say are the biggest distractors for caregivers in coaching success?
Okay, all right. Well, I would say that both the professionals and professional literature often focus on what the caregivers do wrong. In my research, I also found that some of the things that they were doing, the caregivers were doing, wasn't being picked up by professionals. They were looking at the communication and not what was actually happening with the caregiver. So a particular style of conversation I found was, I called it you before me. And it was where caregivers put their own needs ahead of the person they supported. So it was really important the person get their message out. But as a result, the caregiver was often putting themselves in compromising positions with equipment and their posture, and they were getting neck and back pain issues as a direct response of how they were twisting, weight bearing, holding devices, and often for a long period of time. When I asked them about that, a lot of them said, this is just the way it is. If they want to be able to communicate, what else? You know, we have to get ourselves into these positions. So you see a picture, a photograph in course 4 when I look at styles of conversation, where you've got a mum sitting with her child who's got some physical impairment, and she's sitting with a water jet that comes out of the pavement, you know, that you often see in parks. Now, it looks lovely. We're all looking at the kid, we're all looking at the mum, we're looking at the interaction at this level. But if you look down, she's saturated. So her skirt is wet to the point that it must be going in her pants. And she's still smiling. We have to look at the whole person. and see what communication really means to them and try and overcome some of that. Because if they start to think that it's just the way communication is, they can be in for an uncomfortable journey that might not necessarily have to be that uncomfortable. I'm just thinking, I wasn't going to give too many anecdotes, but another really good one is that I went to visit a mum who had an adult daughter with profound communication and mobility needs. And she moved her from the bed, from one chair, sorry, it was from one chair to another, but she didn't use the hoist. And I remembered that so much work from the professional team had gone into this hoist. So I asked her, why don't you use the hoist? And she said, this is the only opportunity I have to hug my daughter. So by getting her daughter in a bear hug and physically lifting her in her 60s into the chair was her only opportunity to hug the daughter she brought up for the last, 35 years. So again, looking at the whole picture rather than just what comes to mind from the therapist perspective, I think is really important. We need to really be looking at what burden of care means in the way we deliver services. So other distractors for caregivers. I think when a caregiver completes tasks and gains confidence and competence, they're so much more able to assist other people in the team. We need to give them that recognition. If we don't, that's a barrier, that's a distractor, whatever you want to call it. They know their child better than anyone else. So don't leave them in the waiting room while you work your magic, okay? When really we could be skill sharing in the clinic setting, in the classroom, okay? And finally, I would say a distractor is always funding. So we need to be sure that the person's AAC system is replicated in key environments and that everyone is talking to each other. So if there is only a VOCA or a speech generating device in one environment, how is the person going to be able to communicate comparably in others? One of my mums, who I would definitely say is not communication partner, not communication assistant, she's communication coach, okay? This mum acknowledges that her son's teachers don't have time to read notes in the communication book every day between what goes on at home and school. So as a teacher herself and a mum of kids with disability, she uses the iPad as a communication medium. So she films 1 minute each day for her teachers, for the teachers of her two boys, just to show aspects of AAC. And that might be how they're developing their word approximations. So hello at the moment sounds like, oh, okay. So, oh, it's not a yell or just a random noise. That's the word for hello, listen out for it, okay? She shows them how she's using the message buttons, which she's put on walls around the house. And there's one at the bottom of the stairs so that when the boys manage to walk downstairs and their walker isn't handy, they'll hit the button that says, hey guys, where's my walker? All right. And again, you see, it's not programmed with the robotic voice, the synthesized voice. It's done with natural intonation and natural voice. So it gets the reaction. Okay. It's heard probably easier. And she also sends examples of new signs. So the boys went fishing. They went fishing and they caught lots of fish. Now she's just introduced 2 signs. So instead of the posters that say, keyword signing, this is the sign of the week. And I have actually seen one that says, this is the sign of the month, all right? We're going to be there an awful long time. She, in 5 days, has taught the teacher 10 signs. And knowing this mum, she will probably do a theme about fishing and add the signs for fishing throughout the week. So it's not random, okay? Now, the nice thing is that it didn't take the teacher very long to start filming what the boys were doing at school for 1 minute segments. So now we have this very visual interchange, which doesn't just talk about what the boys are doing, it actually shows what they're doing. So we're all on the same page. So, except
Fantastic.
they're brilliant sometimes.
Yes, yes. And I'm thinking of communication dictionaries, right? But such a wonderful use of media, not only to speed the process and make it more efficient, but really to make it richer, because you couldn't describe those signs very well.
No, but also if you start to digitize your communication dictionary, and we have one here called the Connect Me Toolkit, which is much more comprehensive. If it's going to be a digital copy, even for a hospital passport might be a digital copy, you can hyperlink those and they can actually get to see the footage.
Yeah, yeah. Brilliant. I've learned so much from families and just being so innovative and creative when they're given, like you're saying, the tools, the knowledge, and the confidence to really run.
Yes, absolutely. But we have such a valuable role in making that happen so that it doesn't become the professional versus the non-professional. We've got to work together well.
Yeah, absolutely. So on that note of just feeling super positive about this caregiver coaching environment, where do you see and what are those successes in caregiver coaching for the caregiver?
I think for the caregiver, they need to be working with people who don't lose sight of the fact that as a caregiver, they have a dual role. Sometimes they have a role as a communication partner, a role as a caregiver, and then there's their old role before parenthood. And often I find we can harness skills. It might be in computer programming. It might be in art and design. I mean, one of the communication people that I'm working with, partners that I'm working with right now, I had prepared all these lovely photographs for communication, for aided communication, but I didn't know what a great drawer she was, a great artist. And now everyone really wants to look, everyone in the community really wants to look at these pictures because they are so appealing and it brings such joy that the person who is using the AAC is getting all this positive about the artwork and is using them. Whereas perhaps there would be a risk of, oh, she's using those funny egg-headed symbols. You know, I don't know how that works. And a stand back. Okay, now those funny egg-headed symbols is what people have told me they think about the symbols. They're not, that's not my view.
Sure.
But a big accelerator, a big positive in the coaching process, I think, is that everyone doesn't just take time to have these conversations and to gather this information about AAC, but they make time. It has to be a priority. And I think in workshop training, one of the most important activities you can do is do your first session, provide morning tea, make morning tea go for, do you call it morning tea or morning break?
I would be stressed to find anybody who actually takes a morning break.
Ah, okay. Well, we have a break in workshops on the grounds that you only really learn stuff for the first hour and a half. And after that, you'll start to not attend. So we give them these energy top-ups every hour and a half.
Yeah.
And in that first half hour, they are to get themselves a cup of tea or coffee, get themselves some refreshments. They're not to communicate. And that means no aided and no unaided communication. Now, what we actually do at the end of that half hour is get them to come back and write down the behaviors that they found they engaged in and the feelings that they had. Now, a lot of people will say that was such a relief. I don't ever get half an hour to myself not to talk to anyone. But a lot of people too found that they stopped making eye contact with others, that they took themselves off to be alone. You're starting to hear some autism here. Mm-hmm. They started to notice the fine detail in the architecture, in the animal life outside. Okay, so they start to engage in these behaviors that we often see in the people, our clients that we work with when we try and teach AAC. So I often suggest, okay, now you've got to do that for, let's say, the whole weekend. What do you think you might be doing at the end of the weekend? And the reaction is usually, or pulling your hair out, okay? So again, if we did that, in workshop training, as a positive, it shows that we are acknowledging the frustration that they see in the person that they're working with. We're not coming in here as experts with a prescription. We should be coming in here with empathy and understanding. Okay. An example of the creativity that can come from that, I showed in course 3, where we look at aided communication, and a gentleman who needed to use, from acquired brain injury, a VOCA. And he went from PASS, from partner assisted scanning, to using a VOCA. And you might think that that's success, but his son could not use the VOCA or tolerate his dad using a VOCA, because it reflected such a different relationship. But what he had seen in the therapy process was talking mats. And he eventually bought in the little cards for all the football teams and did footy tipping. I don't know if you have the same thing there, where you predict which team is going to win in the forthcoming games. So we have a list of all the football games that are going to be played on the weekend. And on Friday, people guess or predict which team is going to win. So using the talking mat framework, he just gave his dad this icon for the team, or this name of the team. They're playing this. Where do you think this one's going to go? Win or lose? And then they could do the same with cooking and other things that they enjoyed together. So what shall we have in the salad? Shall we have carrots or not carrots? Shall we do lettuce or shall we do zucchini? Okay. They could still maintain their father-son relationship, but it wasn't using the system that was seen to be the ultimate by the therapists. All right. But still, you recognize it, you reinforce it, you acknowledge it and say, that's well done, fantastic. I think to answer your question, the positive is that we have to acknowledge.
Yeah,
and so create.
I'm hearing so much in your accelerators being that meeting that family where they are, and really helping them realize their goals. Yes. And not our goals. And do you find that as an SLP, your speech pathologist professional self kicks in and finds that you are tempted to want to push families in a more robust direction with their systems? And if so, how do you navigate that?
I think I did. I think I was very judgmental. I mean, people will say to another person, you don't know what it's like until you've had kids. I used to say the most incredible things like, practice your tongue and lip exercises at the dinner table. And then I had my kids. No, we just practice getting the food in safely, cleanly, and getting out of here. So until you've actually experienced it, you don't add a layer, I think, to your skills as a therapist. And I think as you get older and the risk of needing AAC becomes more visible on the horizon, I think that need to take a big role in communication partner training becomes greater. Because I know from my point of view, I do not want to be in a nursing home listening to kids programs. I do not want to have communication partners using parentese or shouting at me. And I do not want to have my intellect undermined because I can't communicate. And I think being fortunate enough to see so many people be able to use literacy and really communicate what they're thinking in an autonomous way has really changed the way that I deliver AAC. And that goes back to bliss symbolics, which is a semantic system where people could say anything that they wanted as long as they knew how to combine 250 symbols, still reliant on a communication partner being able to read that. But literacy was always there. And I think maybe David Copenhagen, I may have got the name wrong, but someone said that AAC without literacy is not AAC. So for me, AAC and literacy must go together, and we must also be as open as we can about the types of AAC we use with an eye on the future.
So wonderful. I'm loving everything you've shared with us. And I'm assuming that a big part of your 5-course series will expand on some of these techniques and ideas that you're sharing with us today.
Yes, they do. What they the participants get in course 2 is a glossary of communication partner strategies that they can start to add the strategies that they learn throughout the courses and beyond. And they also get a communication partner dictionary of natural gestures, which would then extend into formal signing. So there are some resources there that could last many years.
Wonderful. So I will make sure that we put a link to your training series in the blog post accompanying this video and also in the notes below the video on YouTube. Is there anything else you'd like to share about your work or your training before we sign off today?
No, I think you've covered everything beautifully. Thank you, Tana.